This is my true story. I raised my son with love, food, and sacrifice. I wanted him to have everything I never had. When he became rich, I thought I'd finally rest and see him proud. But one day, when I reached out to hold his newborn baby, he pulled the child away and said, "I smelled bad." His wife laughed while I stood there with tears in my eyes. That moment broke something inside me, but it also woke something up. But the next day, I did something that destroyed him and his ego. Before I tell you how, tell me where you're watching from and please subscribe. I went to see my newborn grandchild for the first time. I had saved my pension money to buy a small toy. It wasn't much, but it was all I could give. My hands shook as I walked up to their new house, the one I helped pay for years ago. He opened the door with the baby in his arms. For a second, I felt proud. I saw the same little boy I once carried through rain and hunger. I thought that moment would heal everything between us. But when I reached out to hold the child, his face changed. He stepped back, wrinkled his nose and pulled the baby away. The words came out cold and sharp, words I will never forget. He said I smelled bad. He said not to touch his baby. His wife laughed behind him, covering her mouth but not her pride. I froze, still holding the toy I had bought, still smiling as if pretending would make it hurt less. The silence in that house was louder than any shout. The baby cried, but no one looked at me. The man I raised, the boy who once slept in my arms, looked at me like a stranger from the street. I placed the toy gently on the table and nodded. My throat burned, but I said nothing. I turned and walked out the same door I had walked through hundreds of times before, this time as a guest who wasn't welcome. Outside, the wind hit my face. I didn't have an umbrella, and the rain started again. I kept walking, not caring where the road led. Every step felt like it carried years of memory. School fees, shoes, meals, nights spent fixing things so he could live better. By the time I reached the bus stop, the toy receipt in my pocket was wet and torn. I sat on the bench, staring at it until the ink faded. I thought about the smell he mentioned. The smell of work, of glue, of soap, of survival. Maybe I did smell old. Maybe I did smell tired. But that smell built his world. That smell paid for his life. That smell carried love he never saw. When I reached home, the lights were off. I sat in the dark and took out the bank keys that were still in my drawer. He had forgotten them. He had forgotten everything I once gave him. That night, I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, replaying his voice over and over. Something changed inside me. It wasn't rage. It was silence, the kind that doesn't cry, doesn't shout, doesn't beg. It was the silence that plans, the silence that waits, the silence that knows exactly what to do next. The next morning, the city was still wet from last night's rain. The streets were quiet, and the air smelled like dust and water. I walked without purpose, my shoes soaked, my thoughts louder than traffic. I didn't know where I was going, but every step felt lighter than the one before. I didn't tell anyone what happened. There was no point. Words couldn't change the truth. My son had said enough to last me a lifetime. The world felt smaller now. Smaller, but clearer. I could finally see what kind of man I had raised. I stopped by a tea stall and stood under the tin roof. Steam rose from the kettle, fogging the glass. I watched other men laughing, talking, holding their children close. It felt strange seeing what love looked like from the outside. In my pocket were the same bank keys I once gave him when he started his business. He had forgotten I still had them. He thought I was old, confused, and harmless. He was wrong. I never forgot anything that mattered. Those keys opened more than a bank locker. They opened memories. They opened control. He never changed the signatures. He never changed the joint accounts. I smiled quietly to myself, realizing how blind pride can make a man. I kept walking until the sky cleared. The roads were muddy, my pants wet, but my mind was dry and sharp. I passed the same office where he once brought me to show off. I had been proud then. Now I felt nothing. The truth hit me. I wasn't poor anymore. He just made me believe I was. Every business he owned, every account he managed, every property he built, they all began with my money, my name, my work. He forgot that the roots of his fortune were written in my handwriting. At a small corner shop, I bought bread and milk. The shopkeeper smiled and said, "You're always calm, Uncle. Nothing seems to bother you." I nodded, holding back a laugh. Calm wasn't peace. Calm was planning. When I reached home, I took out the ledger I had kept hidden for years. The papers were old, the ink faded, but the numbers were still there. My signature was next to his on every deal. I stared at them for a long time, running my fingers over the pages. The same son who called me useless was still standing on the foundation I built. He thought time had erased my power. He was wrong again. Age doesn't make you weak, it makes you invisible, and invisibility is strength when no one expects you to act. I opened the drawer where the passwords were written on a folded note. My hands didn't shake this time. I sat at the table, placed the keys beside the ledger, and took a deep breath. I looked around my small house, cracked walls, old fan, dim light, and smiled. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Everything he owned came from here. Every dollar he flaunted started from this room. By the time the clock struck midnight, my thoughts had turned cold. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns too fast. This was something else. Quiet, steady, and final. Sometimes silence is the loudest weapon, and that night I decided to use it. I sat at my kitchen table that night with only one light bulb glowing above me. The room was quiet except for the ticking clock. My dinner sat cold on the plate. I wasn't hungry anymore. The same table had once been our family's heart. Birthdays, exams, celebrations, all began there. Now it felt like a courtroom where memories stood on trial. I pulled the old metal box from under the bed and placed it beside my plate. Inside were papers, bank slips, and ledgers I hadn't touched in years. Each page carried my name next to his. Each line reminded me how his success began. The first business registration form, the tax files, the property deeds, all of them signed by my hand. I stared at the ink and realized that his empire was never his alone. He had built his pride on a foundation that belonged to me. I opened the ledger and flipped through the records. My eyes moved over the numbers like reading an obituary. Every transaction was a sacrifice, a loan I never took back, a gift he never returned, a trust he never earned. The words blurred for a moment, but I didn't cry. My heart was too dry for tears. I poured myself a glass of water and looked at the reflection in it. Wrinkles, gray hair, rough hands, all proof of years that gave everything for him. I used to think being a father meant forgiving endlessly. That night, I learned being a man meant knowing when to stop. By midnight, anger wasn't fire anymore, it was ice. I stopped shaking. I started thinking. I wrote down every account I remembered, every password, every property I still legally held. I made a list that grew longer with each memory. The more I wrote, the more I realized how blind he had been. He thought time made me weak. He thought old age erased intelligence. He thought kindness meant helplessness. But he forgot something. I was the man who taught him everything he knew about business, about money, about life. I could still undo what I helped him build. I picked up the bank keys from the table and turned them in my hand. Small, silver, and cold, yet heavier than any insult he ever gave me. I knew exactly what I was going to do. Not out of revenge, but out of balance. Every system corrects itself eventually. I stacked the documents neatly, tied them with a rubber band, and placed them in my old leather bag. My decision was quiet, but it felt louder than any argument we ever had. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to move my hand. I leaned back on the chair, closed my eyes, and let the clock tick toward dawn. The world outside kept sleeping, but my mind didn't. I thought of the years he lived without gratitude and how easily he would crumble once the floor beneath him disappeared. By morning, I had decided exactly when and how it would happen. No yelling, no confrontation, just numbers, documents, and signatures, the language he understood best. I blew out the light and sat in darkness for a while, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own breathing, and the distant noise of the city waking up. I felt calm for the first time in years. Tomorrow would not be the same. Tomorrow would belong to me again. The morning sunlight came through the window, falling over the pile of papers I had left on the table. I sat down, took a deep breath, and opened the first folder. Every document inside carried something powerful, proof that time had not erased my name. The trust fund he used to build his company was still under my signature. The joint bank account he had forgotten about still listed me as a primary holder. The property his family lived in was still tied to my ownership. Line after line, I saw my authority written clearly in ink he never cared to check. He had called me useless. He had said I was old and smelled like poverty. Yet the money that fed his pride still flowed through doors I could lock at will. All those years of paperwork, carefully filed and stored, had become my quiet weapon. I spent hours going through each page. The tax papers, the business licenses, the partnership deeds, everything. He never removed me because he thought I would never understand them. He underestimated me. He thought kindness meant ignorance. He was wrong. By noon, I had everything ready. Account numbers, codes, and legal details, all laid out neatly beside my cup of tea. I didn't need revenge. I just needed fairness. Life had taken too much from me already. This time, I would take back what was mine. I called the bank using the same contact I had trusted for decades. My voice was calm, steady, almost emotionless. Years of being ignored had taught me patience. The manager still remembered me. He greeted me respectfully, unaware of the storm I was about to release. I asked for a full review of my accounts. I confirmed ownership. I verified signatures. The system hadn't changed. My name still opened the locks he thought were his. One phone call, a few confirmations, and the control was back in my hands. I hung up and stared at the wall. My heart didn't race. I wasn't scared. I was strangely calm, like a man who had already lost everything and now had nothing left to fear. Power feels different when you no longer crave it. Cleaner, colder, quieter. In the afternoon, I took a bus to the main bank branch. The staff greeted me politely, offering me a seat. I handed them the documents one by one, answering their questions with precision. Every stamp, every signature, every approval fell into place. I signed where they told me to sign. I waited when they asked me to wait. I smiled when they thanked me for my patience. None of them knew the story behind the paper they were processing. That it wasn't just a transaction, it was a reckoning. When I stepped out of the bank, the sun was bright but soft. I held the updated statements in my hand, the proof that everything he owned still ran through me. For years, I had thought I was powerless. That morning, I learned I was the foundation he had built his life on. I walked back home slowly, feeling every step steady and deliberate. The same street that once made me feel small now felt different. People passed me, cars honked, children played, and for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt alive again. He could mock my smell, my clothes, my silence, but he couldn't erase my name from the paper. The world forgets faces, not signatures, and mine was everywhere that mattered. That night, I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to see anything. I just sat in the dark, smiling faintly, knowing exactly what I would do next. One phone call had changed everything, and I wasn't done yet. The next morning came with a faint fog outside my window. The air was cold, but my thoughts were warm and sharp. I woke up earlier than usual, made tea, and sat near the phone. I didn't plan to call him. I didn't need to. The plan was already in motion. I checked the documents again. Everything was aligned, every detail correct. The bank manager had confirmed the updates overnight. The balances were now under my control. I looked at the clock. It was 8:05 a.m. The same time he usually sent his routine messages, short, careless, and full of arrogance. At 8:07, the phone buzzed. His name flashed on the screen, but it wasn't a call. It was a message. 5 words that carried more pride than sense. Don't come around again. You embarrass us. I read it twice, then placed the phone face down on the table. The same son who once begged me for his first business loan was now telling me I was an embarrassment. I smiled, not in anger, but in disbelief at how blind success makes people. He didn't know that while he slept in luxury, the money beneath his bed had already shifted. The accounts he bragged about no longer belonged to him. Every transfer was done, every clause activated, every code changed. The man who looked down on me was already standing on hollow ground. I finished my tea and washed the cup slowly. I didn't rush. Power doesn't rush. It waits. I folded the updated bank papers neatly and tucked them inside my coat pocket. Then I stepped outside. The sky was clearing and the city was waking up. People hurried to work, cars honked, shops opened. I walked through it all unnoticed, just another old man blending into the crowd. But inside, I carried something none of them could see. Freedom. At the bus stop, I saw a newspaper with his photo on the front page. Young entrepreneur expands company to new city. The article praised his growth, his confidence, his vision. I laughed quietly. Vision without roots always collapses. He had forgotten where the money came from, whose hands built the first steps of his empire. I rode the bus back toward the bank just to make sure everything was finalized. The clerk smiled at me and confirmed all the transfers were complete. My name sat alone now on every document. $2 million, the same wealth that once made him arrogant, was back in my possession. I left the bank and stood outside for a long time, watching people go in and out. None of them knew that a quiet storm had just passed through those walls. They didn't know that a father had just taken back what a son had stolen in respect. I stopped by a small bakery, bought a loaf of bread, and sat by the park bench nearby. Birds gathered around me as I fed them crumbs. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel weak. I didn't feel like someone's burden. He had sent me words meant to cut, but all they did was sharpen my clarity. The same message that was supposed to humiliate me had become my reminder that I didn't need to ask for respect. I just needed to take back my worth. When I got home, I placed the bank statements inside the metal box, locked it, and kept the key under my pillow. The room felt lighter, the air cleaner. I lay back on my bed and stared at the ceiling, letting silence fill the space where pain used to live. By then, everything was done. He didn't know it yet. But by the time the sun rose again, the world he stood on would start to crumble. The man who said I embarrassed him was about to learn what real shame feels like. I woke up before sunrise. The sky was still dark and the streets were empty. The city was asleep, but my mind was wide awake. I packed my old suitcase, the same one I had carried decades ago when I came to this city with nothing. This time, I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I placed my clothes neatly inside, folded the documents, and sealed them in a brown envelope. The bank statements, property deeds, and withdrawal slips all fit perfectly. I looked around my small house one last time. The cracked walls, the squeaky fan, the worn-out chair. Everything that had witnessed my life in silence. On the table, I left the house keys, the car papers, and one small handwritten note. It wasn't angry, it wasn't emotional, it was simple. You said I smelled bad. Now breathe without me. I placed the note under his old photograph and turned away. Outside, the air was cold and heavy. I locked the door gently and slipped the key into the neighbor's mailbox. I didn't need to come back. The house wasn't home anymore. It was a memory, and I was done living inside memories. The first bus of the morning arrived with a hiss of brakes. I climbed in, took the corner seat, and looked out the window as the city rolled past. The roads I once walked with pride now looked like a movie playing in reverse. Every place I had worked, every building I had built, every corner that carried my effort, all fading behind me like dust in the morning light. At the bank, the guard opened the door and smiled. He didn't know what I was about to do. I walked straight to the counter, filled out the final withdrawal forms, and handed them to the clerk. She checked the records twice, confirmed my signature, and nodded. Within minutes, the transaction was complete. $2 million, transferred into my new private account. The same amount that had once been his lifeline. The money he used to brag about at parties was now under my control again. The clerk asked if I wanted to close the joint accounts. I said yes. She printed the confirmation slip, stamped it, and handed it over with a polite smile. To her, it was just paperwork. To me, it was freedom. When I stepped out of the bank, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner. I stood under the open sky and looked up. The sun was rising behind the tall glass buildings he once called his empire. I smiled at the irony. The same empire was now standing on air. I walked to the nearest cafe, ordered coffee, and watched people rushing to work. Some looked tired. Some looked proud. I looked peaceful. No one there knew that a father had just disappeared with his son's fortune, not out of greed, but out of justice. I took the train that afternoon. No destination in mind, just distance. Each passing station felt like a page closing. I didn't look back. I didn't think about his face, his words, or his laughter. He had erased me from his life. Now, I was erasing myself from his world. Completely. By nightfall, I reached a quiet coastal town. The streets were narrow, the air smelled of salt, and the sea roared softly in the distance. I found a small inn and rented a room. No questions asked, just a key, a bed, and silence. I sat by the window, listening to the waves. My phone buzzed a few times, but I didn't touch it. I turned it off, placed it in the drawer, and let the world lose me. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without anger, without noise, without shame. The man he called embarrassing had vanished, not into weakness, but into freedom. And by the time he woke up the next morning, his world would already be gone. The morning after I disappeared, his world began to crack. The first call came from the bank. His accounts were frozen. The second came from his accountant. The trust fund was locked. The third came from his business partner, shouting about missing money and failed transfers. By noon, his calm smile had turned into panic. He rushed to the bank with his usual arrogance, demanding answers. The manager met him politely but firm. The signatures had changed. The permissions had shifted. The system showed only one active name: mine. His voice grew louder. His hands slammed the counter. But nothing worked. His money was gone. Back at his office, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Investors were calling, suppliers were complaining, and employees were whispering. The man who once laughed at me now sat in his expensive chair, gripping his hair, realizing that his empire was built on a foundation he didn't own. Every piece of success, every car, every property, every comfort, all tied to the documents I signed years ago. He tried to call me. I didn't answer. He called again. Still nothing. He even sent his driver to my house, but the house was empty. Only the note on the table waited for him. 5 words written in black ink. Now breathe without me. He read it again and again until the meaning finally hit. His wife screamed at him for losing everything. The same woman who laughed when he insulted me now shouted in panic. The bills were due. The credit cards were blocked. The investors pulled out. Even the car in their driveway was no longer theirs. The comfort they once flaunted turned into silence. By the second day, the newspapers had caught the story. Young businessman faces financial collapse. He avoided the cameras, covered his face, and hid from the press that once called him a rising star. The interviews stopped. The invitations stopped. The laughter stopped. The same people who used to crowd around him now crossed the street when they saw him. Respect turns into pity faster than money disappears. He learned that the hard way. He tried to borrow from friends, but none of them wanted to risk it. Everyone suddenly remembered their debts. Meanwhile, I was far away. The sea breeze touched my face as I sat on a wooden bench, reading a newspaper that carried his story. His fall didn't make me smile, but it didn't make me sad either. It simply made things fair. He called my phone again that night, not once, but 10 times. The calls went unanswered. He sent messages, long and desperate, full of words he never said before. "Dad, please. Let's talk. I need help." But help is not a one-way street. I had begged for respect, not money. Now he begged for both. His wife left within a week. She took what little she could and didn't look back. The house was quiet again. But this time, not mine. The same silence that once hurt me was now his. He went back to the same people he had mocked in his climb to success. None of them opened their doors. Pride doesn't feed you when the plate is empty. And now, for the first time, he understood the hunger that I had lived through for years. I heard from a neighbor weeks later that he had been visiting my old house often. He would stand outside the gate, staring at the locked door, as if waiting for me to appear. But I was gone. My shadow no longer belonged to that place. The son who once told me I smelled bad was now living with the scent of failure around him. The smell of unpaid bills, spoiled food, and sleepless nights. Life has a sharp sense of humor. The man who mocked me for being poor now understood how heavy poverty feels when no one else will share the load. Weeks passed in silence. I didn't check my phone, didn't open my email, didn't look back. I lived in a small rented room facing the sea. The air smelled of salt, not greed. Every morning, I watched the sun rise with a cup of black coffee and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Then, one evening, the phone rang. The same number that once sent orders now flashed on my screen like a ghost from another life. I let it ring twice, 3 times, then answered. His voice was different, weak, trembling. Nothing like the confident tone that used to fill boardrooms and parties. He didn't say my name with pride anymore. He said it with desperation. The first thing I heard was his breathing, fast, broken, tired. He said the company was gone, the house was gone, the car was gone. He said the bank wouldn't help him, that no one would answer his calls. He said he didn't even have money for rent. I didn't interrupt him. I just listened. The same silence he once used to humiliate me now belonged to me. Every word he spoke was a piece of the arrogance falling off him. He tried to sound calm at first, pretending it was just a mistake. But as he spoke, his voice cracked. I could hear the weight of hunger and regret pressing on his throat. He wasn't talking to a father anymore. He was talking to survival itself. He said he was sorry. He said he never meant what he said that day. He said he was under stress, that he didn't realize how much I had done for him. I didn't answer. I let the wind and waves fill the silence between us. Sometimes words don't deserve answers. He asked if I could help. Just a small amount. Just enough to get him through the week. I could almost see him sitting there, hunched over, gripping the phone, waiting for mercy. The same hands that once pushed me away now reached out, shaking. I looked out the window at the ocean. The waves rose and fell like breaths. For the first time, I felt nothing. No hate, no pity, no victory. Just a clean, quiet emptiness. I told him to take care of himself. Nothing more. Then I hung up. No shouting, no insults. Just a soft click. The sound of finality. It was like closing a coffin lid. Not on a person, but on the pain they caused. I turned off the phone and placed it in the drawer. I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. The silence after that call was different. It wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of being free. He had taken everything from me once: respect, dignity, peace. Now, without even realizing it, he had given it all back. I went for a walk along the beach. The sand was cool under my feet, the wind soft against my face. I thought about the boy he used to be. The boy who once said, "Dad, I'll make you proud." Maybe that boy still existed somewhere under the man's ruin. Maybe one day he would find him again. But that was no longer my job. I had already done my part, as a father, as a man, as a survivor. The sound of the waves covered the memory of his voice. The sea doesn't care who cries, who wins, or who loses. It only washes everything clean. And that night, I slept peacefully. Not because I had money, but because I finally had nothing left to forgive. The sea became my home, the waves, my only company. I rented a small house by the shore, white walls, wooden windows, a rusted gate that squeaked every time the wind blew. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No noise, no demands, no one to look down on me. Every morning I woke to the sound of gulls circling above. The sunlight entered my room slowly, warm and soft. I made tea, stepped outside, and watched fishermen pull in their nets. Their laughter filled the air, simple and honest. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel old. I felt alive. I walked to the market every day. The shopkeepers smiled and called me sir, not mockingly, not out of duty, but with respect. They didn't know who I was or what I had done. To them, I was just another quiet man who paid in cash and never bargained. It was peaceful. I spent my afternoons feeding stray cats that gathered near my porch. Some days I fixed small things around the house: the loose door hinge, the broken fan, the uneven shelves. It reminded me of the days I used to fix shoes for a living, except now I did it for joy, not survival. At night, I sat by the window with the sound of the waves echoing through the room. The phone stayed silent. The world that once judged me no longer had a voice here. I was free from every insult, every comparison, every name they called me. I started keeping a notebook, not for business, not for numbers, just thoughts. I wrote down everything I learned after losing everything I loved. I wrote that money without respect is poison. I wrote that silence is not weakness, it's strength waiting for the right time. I wrote that love dies not from distance, but from pride. Sometimes I wondered what he was doing. If he had found a job, if he still lived in that big empty house, if he ever looked at the baby, my grandchild, and thought of me. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate takes energy, and I was done wasting mine. One morning, I saw a small child playing near the water. His laughter reminded me of my son when he was young. The innocence before greed, before pride, before forgetting where he came from. I smiled, realizing that life always gives second chances, just not always to the same people. I started donating small amounts quietly, to fishermen who lost their nets, to widows who couldn't pay rent, to children who needed school books. I didn't tell anyone my name. I didn't want thanks. I just wanted balance. The money that once caused me pain now brought peace to others. My days passed slowly, but they were clean. No guilt, no shame, no anger. I cooked, I read, I walked, I breathed. The world didn't owe me anything, and I didn't owe it either. Sometimes at night, when the wind was strong, I imagined hearing his voice, not calling me names, not mocking me, but calling me Dad. I would open my eyes and remind myself it was just the waves. Time has a way of washing everything away, even the sounds that once hurt the most. I kept the note he wrote me years ago, the one where he said I embarrassed him. I didn't tear it. I didn't burn it. I kept it as proof that pain doesn't destroy you. It shapes you. It teaches you how to rebuild. The man who left with nothing now had peace worth more than millions. The man who was told he smelled bad now breathed the clean air of freedom every day. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to go back. Not for revenge, not for closure, not for forgiveness. I had already found everything I needed, right here, between the sound of the sea and the silence of being free. Time has passed, and I still live by the sea. The sound of the waves is my reminder that life always balances itself, no matter how unfair it seems. I don't count the money anymore. It's not about that. It never was. It's about peace. And peace finally found me. He used to say I smelled bad. Now he smells of regret every morning. The scent of fear, of failure, of empty pockets. The world he once ruled has turned its back on him. The friends who once laughed with him now avoid his calls. The house that once echoed with pride now stays dark and cold. I imagine him sitting alone, staring at the same walls he once built with arrogance. Maybe he finally understands that respect cannot be bought. Maybe he finally knows that the man he mocked was the same man who made him possible. Pride blinded him, but loss opened his eyes. Sometimes I still see his face in my mind. Not the rich man with his fancy clothes, but the little boy who used to run to me after school, hungry and smiling. I wish I could have saved that boy from the man he became. But life teaches through pain, not comfort. I didn't destroy him. I simply stepped away and let truth do its work. The same hands he once pushed aside now hold the power he lost. The same name he tried to erase now lives on every document he still wishes he had. I don't hate him. I don't love him either. I've gone beyond both. I feel nothing but quiet understanding. He planted humiliation, and he harvested humility. That's how nature works. You always reap what you sow. My days are simple now. I wake up, feed the cats, read the paper, and watch the tide come in. Some days the sea is calm, some days it's rough. But no matter what, it always returns to the shore. Just like life. He thought I vanished with his money. But what I really took was his certainty. The belief that he was untouchable. That he could insult and still stand above everyone. That's what's gone now. And in its place, maybe one day he'll find gratitude. I don't need an apology. I don't need his voice, his company, or his approval. What I needed, I already found. Silence that doesn't hurt. He'll live long enough to understand what I learned too late. Never shame the hands that once fed you. Because one day, those hands might be the ones holding your future. And if that day ever comes, he'll finally know, not through anger, not through revenge, but through life itself. That respect is the only wealth that never disappears.